The house breathed in draughts so cold they tasted metallic, and the hall's hush was not empty but layered, a static packed with insect wings, with the faint fizz of salt drying on old wood, with whispers the plaster had learned to hold for a century. When I pushed the door and stepped into Eversley, dust lifted slow and deliberate, as if considering whether to rise at all. It smelled of orris root and damp silk. Somewhere inside, a hinge sighed like a tired throat. The light in late afternoon came through buckled glass in pale ribbons, and each ribbon cut across the floorboards with the severity of a ruler laid on flesh. I had been in dead houses before. Conservators must be intimate with abandonment. But Eversley was not dead. It had the trapped patience of something waiting for a cue. "My advice," said the caretaker behind me, "is don't touch the gold." His name was K, 70, thin as a coat hanger, tugging the collar of his sweater like a man ashamed of his own neck. He had already told me about raccoons and a sprung slate roof and the basement that took water. He had not told me what the gold was. "Just catalogue what they asked," he added, quieter, as if our voices could scuff the air. "There's a room upstairs and you'll smell it before you see it." I'm used to strange smells. I set down my carrier, the long canvas roll with brushes, swabs and cloth. "And I won't touch anything I shouldn't." I didn't tell him I have a habit I can't break. I taste what I'm conserving, not like a thief, more like testing a battery to see if it still has charge, a flake of lacquer on the tongue, the acid tang of a century of candle grease. I tell myself information lives in senses. I tell myself I'll recognize my mother's slipping mind if I keep my senses sharp enough to cut. "You're the first they've let in since the last of them died." Kay turned his eyes toward the stair and not toward me. She wanted to be buried in the foyer. Imagine that. It took the board 6 months to say no. I glanced at the portrait opposite the stairs. A woman looked down, all pale organza and a neck like a swan's, but with the damp, heavy gaze of someone deep in a bath. The painter had caught the moment when attention begins to curdle. It made the corners of her wide mouth look tired. The plaque beneath the frame read, "Cecilia Vance Eversley, c. 1890. The varnish had browned and a bloom crept like milk across one edge, the way these things go if left. But what caught me more was that the eyes had been carefully scraped out to the ground, a conservator's enemy, a vandal's pleasure, not torn in rage but meticulously removed with a razor. She did that. Kay rubbed at the notch above his sternum, a habit as constant as breath. "You'll find a lot of faces in here, don't look back." He left me to the first floor rooms. They were what you'd expect from a Newport imitation, scowling fireplaces, ceilings with a honey of tobacco film near the chandeliers, parquet the color of whiskey. I moved slow, sampling smells and light, jotting in my book. The music room held a piano with teeth yellowed like old corn, sheet music left open to a waltz, l'applaudissement. Someone with a neat old-fashioned hand had underlined 2 measures and written, "Hold here until they beg." The music stand's edge was sticky with something sweet that never dried. Empty rooms collect noises that have no source. In Eversley, the noises had a peculiar intimacy. A fingernail tapping on glass, but only once, as if to see if I would notice. The drag of silk, a round of breath that did not come from me. Each sound arrived and then held very still nearby, like a stranger who wants to be included in the conversation but cannot yet speak. When I went up, the stairs made a brittle crack at exactly the spot where my weight shifted forward. On the landing, a window-paned door let onto a terrace furred with moss. Beyond it, ocean offered itself in the briefest slice between black trees. The light had thinned to the hour when the house gained in confidence. Something sweet and chalky drifted down the corridor, rolling over the older smells of mice and damp. I followed. The gold room earned its name with no effort of metaphor. Its walls were leafed, every panel, cornice and architrave hammered with gold as thin as breath. Where the leaf had let go, flakes lay like fallen moths on the floor. The air had the hot paper reek of gilding size, though no brush had passed here for 100 years. The ceiling had been painted a pale blue, and a chandelier hung from it with the lethargic menace of something that wanted to fall. Mirrors faced mirrors, their mercury backing gone to black tides. A long, low table ran the length of the room. On it, place cards, a garland of dried roses collapsed into tea-colored lace, a row of goblets that looked as if they had been poured from metal still cooling. I took a step, and the gold answered with the soft scold of 1,000 tiny leaves rubbing. It's a trick of gilded rooms that they seem warm when they're cold. The leaf catches light and returns it as if it were heat. The gold room did not return anything. It took. I stood very still until my pulse let go of my throat. The smell was strongest here, orris, sugar, and something medicinal that rasped. It powdered the tongue. I had the child's silly urge to lick the wall. That was when the air changed. Not colder, not warmer. Tilted, like the room had been a painting that someone lifted and then lowered an inch. "Host," said a voice behind my ear, very lightly. I turned and saw my own reflection wanting to be someone else. It was only me in the mirror, a woman in her 30s, not as thin as last year, hair that could not be persuaded to stay pulled back, a small stubborn chin, the same scar at my lip from when I cracked it on my mother's dresser as a child. But everything around me had shifted one beat off. The leaf in the reflection rippled while the leaf in the room lay still. My reflection's mouth moved in the right way to breathe, but I had not yet drawn my breath. It was enough. I left the gold room with the precise speed of a person not running. At the end of the corridor, an alcove held a glass case filled with hair. We've forgotten that hair once meant love, loyalty, mourning. It held life like a wire holds a current. Rings, bracelets, small wreaths braided so finely it must have taken hours to convince each strand into a pattern. A little card read, "From the ladies." No date. The patience in the braiding hurt to look at. I think of the women who did this, tongue tucked against the roof of the mouth, the cotton smell of hair warmed by fingers, the certainty of hand that makes grief neat. The back of the case had a slot through which I could see something beyond, some slice of black space. I put my ear to it, very far away, the faintest applause. That night in the lodging Kay had arranged, I dreamed in a room I had not entered, not yet. I was face down on a carpet that printed my cheek with its pattern, little ropes and laurels, knotted into figure eights, as if twin loops pinned me to the floor. Music came from a horn. It was tinny and near asphyxiated. In the dream I couldn't move my left hand. My right hand found a flake on the carpet and brought it to my mouth without my permission. The flake dissolved quick as sugar but left a bitterness like coins. In the morning the taste was still there. Brush my teeth, coffee, salted oatmeal. It persisted, in the same way grief persists when time has satisfied itself that you should be done. I began the routine. Conservators thrive on order. Order keeps the mind from the corners where it finds its own teeth. Work light, swabs damped with distilled water. The little fish scale sound of cotton moving through dust. I started with frames. Most frames here were blistered, holding pictures that refused to keep their color. The glass in the morning rooms had developed its own small climate. They wept inside, beads of water lines racing one another down. Measuring a rococo frame in a bedroom that must have been blue once upon a fortune, I noticed a hairline at the wall where the paper had lifted. Not accidental, a deliberate slit. Long fingers could slip through. The slit ran around the entire room at chair rail height. This was not a cut for wiring, it was a cut that could admit a thread, and then I saw them, the tiniest gold loops at intervals, hammered flat to the paper and painted over, so you almost couldn't tell them from the pattern. Each loop could hold what? A garland, a veil. I pictured a room draped in something spun very fine, threaded through all the loops, pulled taut so that if you tried to leave, if you stood too fast, the net would cling, the loops would sing along the walls, a room that would exhale when you cut it loose. "Don't touch the gold," Kay had said. I kept my fingers very clean and very still. I wrote in my book, loops, thread marks, and under it I wrote what I didn't want to admit hearing in my head, audience. Eversley's archive sat in a room with the damp chewed smell of old paste and a window that couldn't make up its mind about being open, letters bundled with fraying ribbon, cabinet cards of women gone stiff from keeping their necks proud for the camera's long gaze. I read until the page edges frayed besides the original fray. Cecilia Vance was 20 when she married Charles Eversley, 37. A railroad man who understood that in America you can make tradition in a decade if you stamp it hard enough. She became the hostess she was taught to be by women who did not smile unless they were being watched. The newspapers liked the way she dressed and the way she gave money as if she couldn't bear to touch it. The panic of 1893 took more than money. The men who dined at Eversley sold and borrowed until their debt had a body. It lay down beside their wives and warmed their beds. The house went quiet, parties hushed, people moved to smaller cities and pretended it was a change of taste. But Cecilia did not stop. There are invitations in the archive for balls given after the panic, when you could hear the ocean telling the truth at the windows. A masquerade in winter titled The Auric Night. In a clipping someone kept, a columnist wrote, "Mrs. Eversley has distilled light itself into the most exquisite paste," and stubbed the paragraph with a small cigarette burn hole. A program lists applause waltz, polonaise for the patrons, the mirror gavotte. Next to the mirror gavotte, assemble facing reflections. Do not allow the eyes to lift. Behind a folded letter was a newspaper cut in half. The missing half was likely the column Kay told me had been pasted to the kitchen wall, what the family would call the little unpleasantry. The half I had bore a list of the missing and the names of their wives. The article used the polite word absented. The year was 1895. I read Cecilia's hand. It started upright and thin, with a tremor of over-control. As she aged, the lines smoothed. The ink deepened to a black that looked like it wanted to be a bruise. "Dr. Mott," she wrote to a friend, "has prescribed what he calls a rest for me. He writes it like that, as if the letters could heave and expand. He has made a little theatre of my bedroom, in which I may not stir a muscle without permission. I am to drink milk and not read. Not to read is a violence I cannot forgive. I have discovered that if I count the nails in the ceiling, I can pass an hour. If I count the nails while I pretend the ceiling is a stage and my bed the orchestra pit, I can pass 2. The house is not asleep. It wants audience. Someone else's name appeared often among the cards and notes. Eliza Starr, younger, a penniless cousin, come to live with Cecilia at Eversley after her own loss. There was a daguerreotype type of Eliza, a grave girl with a laugh not yet murdered by expectation. Her hair was blunt at the jaw, improper. She wore a dress that was not the right season and did not care. On the back of the daguerreotype, in pencil, someone had written, "She looks at herself like an enemy." They wrote to one another in a code of silk and stone. "We've ordered the leaf, Eliza. £3. Cecilia, never enough. Eliza, I will hang the nets tonight. Cecilia, do not let your pulse be read. It is an error to think the dead were naive. They were as cunning as we are." They had fewer distractions. In the kitchen, Kay drank coffee like penance and tried to warn me without saying the word ghost. She kept having parties when it was bad manners to do so. People came because they always do, even if they hate you. If there's free sugar, they'll let the violin stop their hearts for a while. How did they go missing, I asked. Every house has somewhere people forget to look. He didn't meet my eyes. Anyway, important men never disappear. They become stories. They took their portraits down, I said. Kay's hand went to his neck. It seemed he wanted to press back something, trying to climb out. Cecilia didn't want to see what wasn't there. There is a kind of silence that makes a person sure a noise is about to happen. The gold room had that silence. It was not absence, it was preparation. On the third afternoon, when fog braided itself in the trees and I had not seen the horizon all day, I went back up with alcohol, swabs, a micro spatula, and a roll of thin gold leaf rape. When I wrote in my notes that name made something in me recoil, but it's what it's called. Our professions keep old language like debts. I told myself I would only test the adhesion of the leaf. I told myself I wanted to study the composition of the backing. I told myself a lot of things the house did not find compelling. On the table, the place cards had names I recognized from the half article: Whitmere, Klein, Barstow, Jones. At the center, in neat copperplate curls, hostess. It was empty, as if the card did not deserve the obligation of a name. "Host," said that same voice, so soft it might have been a skin brushed wrong. I set down my swab. "Who are you?" I asked the mirror. The mirror didn't answer. I'm not sure who I hoped would. I turned the goblet in my hand and watched the light knot at its lip. When I set it down, the glass gave a ring that didn't die away fast enough. It reached for a harmony and missed. The door behind me eased closed. I hadn't touched it. The gold room was besieged by curtains heavy enough to smother children. The windows behind them were latched. I had checked them. Still, a draft moved the velvet, the way a lung moves even when a person has decided not to breathe. I went to the nearest curtain and slid my fingers in the crack where it met the wall. Something dry and tiny crisped under my nail. Gold leaf. I rubbed it without intending to, and it became a smear on my thumb that stained like pollen. I put that thumb to my mouth. The gold dissolved. A panic in the body announces itself as a swarm, 1,000 gnats inside the lungs. After the sweet flash, I was left with iron. The word that arrived in my head was not sane. Audience. The chandelier shivered. Not from wind, from interest. I had something of Cecilia in me. My mother would say the same, when she wasn't herself and kindness came out like a weapon. "You like to be looked at, Mara. Don't pretend you don't." She meant it as an accusation. I took it as a profession. The art I loved existed because hands, eyes, breath had already made their worship. It was rude to pretend I was not participating. "Fine," I told the air. "I'm here." I drew a chair away from the table. There is courage that looks like a back straightening. There is another kind that looks like giving yourself to a current and trusting it only to the point where it can dunk you, but not drown. I did not sit, but I put my hands on the chair's rail as if I meant to, and the chair agreed to hold my weight. It was then that I saw the tiles set discreetly along the baseboards, thin as picture frames, covered with a yellowed film. I knelt. They weren't tiles, they were vents. From behind the slits came the faint hiss you could persuade yourself was the sea. I smelled gas. Air in gaslight rooms is loyal. It remembers flame. Even switched off, the smell of a century can wake. Still, the scent was fresh, a halo around the vents. A lightheadedness rose in me, temporal and delicious. The world sharpened. Objects framed themselves 1 degree too aggressively. I stood and told myself this was in the brain. The house wanted me to believe in more than old pipes. That thought comforted me enough to betray me into staying. Behind one mirror hung an oval of black cloth. Thread loops, the twins of those I'd seen in the bedroom, held the cloth in place. I parted it and found not wall but a second mirror, this one with the backing intact and a silver so bright it made my face a mild smear. My reflection looked like a woman about to make a mistake. She planned to call fate. I don't know why I raised my hand. Simple recognition. My body belongs in the same world as its image. The mirror pushed back, soft. You have maybe put your hand to a pane of ice that yields and then resists. That was the feeling, except warmth met me, and with it the weight of breathing on the other side. I flinched. The mirror exhaled on my palm and fogged it. In the fog, for the length of a heartbeat, words, hold here until they beg. I staggered back. The chair behind my shin was mean. I went down, and the carpet caught my face with a print of laurel ropes. When I turned my head, I realized the carpet had been stitched with hair, human hair. The pattern's shadows curled like growth. The gas hiss grew urgent, but no flame burned. My lungs went curious. They wanted more air and less at once. The chandelier shook with an enthusiasm that made it chatter against the ceiling medallion. The medallion had been molded with theater masks, the sneer and the sob. Their plaster mouths were full of dust. I could taste it trickling down the throat. My pulse had moved into rent. I crawled to the door. It did not open. I was not locked in. The latch gave under my hand. It was simply that the door had decided it was part of the wall again. There is a part of fear that goes strange and still. If you have sat beside someone who doesn't know your name anymore, you know that silence. It does not beg or reason. It decides. I decided I would call for help, and I decided I would not. I decided to stand, and I decided the floor belonged to me only in theory. When the horn began, at first I thought it was in the house, and then I thought it was in the wall, and then I realized it was in the mirror. The horn's cry was pinched at the throat, old, recorded. It wobbled with the quake of a machine turning. The tune was the applause waltz. The room consented to believe that music was a reason to be occupied. The voices that entered weren't voices the way conversation is. They were breath shaped into hunger. They said host, not like a title but like a function. The word folded around me, not a request but a precondition. I got to my knees. I don't know why this made the room kinder. A weight like a hand pressed my back between the shoulder blades once, and then let go. I went where a person goes in a room built for the performing female, the end of the table. The place card waiting there glowed a little, though no flame had been lit. I reached for it. My name was in its curls. Not mine, the other one, the one attached to the house, Cecilia Vance Eversley. I'm not her, I said. The house did not care about the pronoun. The vents breathed. I watched the mirror and saw not myself but a room I did not inhabit. No, not quite. A second gold room. Its leaf had not begun decaying. Its chandeliers were lit with the thousand musics of gas. Its table glittered with ornaments that made the eye tired. Men stood at the far end of the reflected room. They looked well as men in old photographs do, because they never had to learn the habit of guilt on their faces. The women beside them had shoulders bare and a quality of endurance painted in their posture that would be more attractive if it were not universal. Cecilia stood in the reflection, at the head, hands on the chair as mine had been. She was not as beautiful as her portrait had tried to be. She was more, a person who had discovered the precise ratio at which attention burns. She looked straight into my eye. I say mine, I mean the me in me. The reflection did not require me as intermediary. You're in the wrong place, she told me. I thought a woman should be allowed at least one thing that is hers. I thought, if I answer aloud, the house will tally it against me. What did you build? I asked. She kept her hands on the chair where I had put mine moments ago and flexed her fingers like a pianist, loosening tendons that already knew their work. What a question, she said. I built an ending. It is what we do. The vent sighed. The chandelier clicked. A small bit of leaf lifted at the seam and fluttered like a moth trying to decide if being alive was a burden worth shouldering. Eliza appeared at Cecilia's shoulder, a smile that had learned how to call itself something else. You are late, Eliza told her. The gentlemen will absent themselves if you keep them unadored. Cecilia looked me in the face again, and I recognized the family courtesy you extend to a cousin who behaves and eats little and rarely complains. We have arranged a room in which nothing will be permitted to become ordinary again, Cecilia said. Will you take a turn with us? I can't breathe, I said. You're using all the air. The men in the reflected room laughed. It wasn't cruel laughter. It was a noise made when your friend makes a joke and you have trained your body to appreciate him instantly. A footman poured into goblets something that moved wrong. It had the viscosity of the mirror's silver. We learned something about attention, Eliza said. Grave. When it is sustained, it becomes a substance, not a metaphor. A substance. You can collect it. It is not visible until the exact moment you humiliate it by calling it visible. You're going to kill them, I said. Kill, Cecilia repeated with a distaste that made me hate her a little. What a graceless word. They won't belong to absence. Absence is vulgar. They will be held. Her hand lifted. The reflected footman's hand lifted in the same moment, though he was behind her. Gaslight brightened. The vents in my world whispered yes and then no and then yes, in a pattern that sounded deliberate. I remembered the loops in the wall. I remembered the rooms strung with hair. We have always made nets, and we have always believed they are for our own good. The last thing I thought I would ever think in such a room was, I want to be watched. Not by them, by something that would not forget me, even if my name bent and broke in the mouth of the person who loved me most. Mara, said a voice that had, across my life, become antique and then original again. Not my mother as she had been. The version of her that had begun to build rooms of stillness where I could not follow. Do not make a stage out of every room. You will be trapped under the scenery. I came to help, I said aloud to a ceiling that in another age had been a sky. Saying aloud cost something I do not regret paying. You came, Eliza said, which is all anyone asks. Mara, not my mother this time. Kay, the house had allowed his name to enter. My body found some of its heat. I crossed to the door and set my hand to the latch. It opened under my skin as if we had reached an agreement we didn't know we were negotiating. I backed out into the corridor. The air out there tasted like linen taken off a line. The gold room waited, chastened. Behind me, Kay took one look at my face and said softly, "Ah." I didn't tell him anything that would make the world show its teeth. We went downstairs and he made tea, the cure for all misapprehensions. I tracked gold leaf from my shoe through the kitchen and into the hall, and was ashamed of it like I would be of blood. That night I slept with the light on. I woke at 2:17 and knew I had woken in the hour when the house rehearsed. The air above my mouth was cold in a shape my lips recognized, not a kiss, the subtraction that precedes one. In the morning I told myself story is always more dangerous than gas. I went back to the archive and opened a ledger bound in peau de chagrin and found, between 2 pages, a flake of something that was not leaf. It was thicker, heavier. I put it on my tongue. It tasted of iron, of mercury, of the made world. In the margin, in Eliza's hand, we are devoured by what we worship. Make the mouth of worship full of our enemies. Below it, less steady, I am so tired of not being permitted to see my own desire in the daylight. Cecilia hosted the Auric Night in January, 1895. There are handbills, a waltz composed for the evening, Mr. and Mrs. Jones to lead, a note in Dr. Mott's hand. Mrs. E, after a brief improvement following the rest, has returned to her habits of self-display. Recommend further confinement and denial of literature. Warned against hosting. Ignored warning. Ruminative face. Tendency to soliloquy. I put my hand to my mouth and tried to stop the laugh that came at denial of literature. A printed card, invitation size, with a single line, hold here until they beg. We talk about madness like it belongs to the person who displays it most vividly. Madness belongs to the room it is allowed to perform in. On the last day I meant to be at Eversley. A storm came without preamble. Rain drummed in a rhythm that made me think of small feet running in places children were not supposed to run. The hall darkened as if the house had been dipped into a vat of tint. I told myself I would take one last survey of the gold room, and then be done. You know how we promise ourselves we are done with the thing that loves to show us we are not. On the stairs I passed the portrait of Cecilia with the eyes carefully excised. A film had developed across the raw places where paint had been scraped, as if flesh meant to grow in and repair the injury. It made me ill enough to nod to her. The men who disappear aren't in the portrait gallery, but the women who insisted are still on the walls. At the threshold of the gold room, the smell of orris and burnt sugar hit with the physicality of a hand. I swallowed, because my body will always try to make sweetness out of a salt. The vents were open, not cracked, gaping. Not gas this time, air moving with intention. It carried the horn's waver. I stepped into the room, and the chandeliers lit in the mirror only, each flame igniting with a small, greedy sigh. Guests entered the reflected room. They were not spectral, they were precise. The detail of an embroidered cuff so accurate it put tears in my throat. The stain of wine at the rim of a glass that had not yet been lifted. The way a foxtail wrapped around a wrist settles and then resists, loving and hating its new life. Cecilia moved toward a door I could not see in my room. She bent her head to listen. When she lifted it, the expression on her face was the one you make when you realize you are the solution and the problem simultaneously. "I will give you what you want," she said, and it wasn't clear which direction her voice moved. She raised her glass, and the room, mirrored and my own, tipped toward riot. Eliza stood behind her. "We wanted an end to the humiliation of asking," Eliza said. "We wanted to make the audience stay." They had laced the vents into the looped walls. They had strung hair through the loops to make a map of breath. They had sealed the doors with nets, so fine you would only feel them with your mouth. They had asked the audience to attend, until it became a thing that pressed back and made demands. They had learned to collect it. They filled goblets with attention. They tried to drink it like cure.